So today I wanted to get into a bit more about how I use SketchUp. Now I'm going to actually show you one of the more complicated models and one of the first models I made for encoding Bushido. Recently somebody asked me why I would be using SketchUp when I use other stuff like professional level, so-called professional level software like Maya or ZBrush or Modo. But in previous videos, I said I gave out a bunch of reasons, and I said it's just because of the way I use SketchUp in encoding Bushido is different from how I use SketchUp professionally for 3D projects or animation. It's those pieces of software like Maya or ZBrush that are creating a final high resolution asset, or for a video game or low resolution project, a low resolution asset, but still a final asset of some kind. None of the models from none of the models from SketchUp are used as final assets. And one of the areas where this makes sense was definitely with this quad transport. Now you can tell from its configuration, it's sort of a vertical takeoff and landing cargo style aircraft, something like C3 Galaxy, or is it C4 Galaxy? But one of those military transports that can side load or breech load different payloads, cargo, and whatever. It's semi-autonomous at some point. I guess it could be used as sort of like a drones nowadays. It could fly on its own, but that's all. Those are all features inside the writing of the book. But the absolute primary reason for this model was that it's something we see a lot throughout the series. And I will say this, that its first appearance in the book wasn't really satisfying to me. If I could bring that up in a second. The first use of this transport was something that was just meant to be a throwaway, but I ended up writing something where I was going to need it to be quite a bit more consistent and more final. I was going to use it more, basically. So the first time this appears is in the following panel. Now, this is, for the most part, it's satisfactory. I had concept art finished already, which, I thought was okay, and I didn't think I was going to use it again in this particular way. You see that, we get, it's really just in some wide and medium wide shots with a semi close-up of the cockpit. And I think in this issue too, we'll only see it one more time, or at least one more time before it becomes entirely referenced by CG. But that's the primary reason is always that it's going to be seen multiple times, and in future issues that was going to be true. So it's the fact that this helps keeps forms, perspective, and other things really consistent, but the rendering style is going to be all my own. So the third reason is that you can find particular angles on something that you might not necessarily find when you're just drawing something. You can have something in your head, but you might not really consider that this could be a cool angle for that particular panel, and therefore give you insight into what that should look like. And you can manipulate, if I could do that here, you can manipulate your field of view to get different angles on that's a telephoto, a really nice tight shot versus something wide angle, which people like. It's more dramatic to them in some ways, but more often than not, I prefer sort of a mid-range. Numerically, you could punch this in professional software. You could actually punch in the exact number for your field of view and the millimeter length of your lens. But in SketchUp, you're just left to, well, that looks good. That's fine. This doesn't need every detail. It never did. It was something I was going to render for sure. And if I can bring up that other page that I'm talking about, you can be able to see that the final render, which is a really sort of dramatic return of this aircraft. It's still rendered by hand, but it's definitely got the original SketchUp render in the background. Now this look is more consistent with a hand rendered look. Whereas SketchUp has its own ability to influence the jitter on the lines, which you can kind of see here. Makes an irregular, almost drawn line. It's still a little too, or not a little. It's still extremely mechanical looking, and not nearly as spontaneous as I've developed my own style in rendering and inks to be. One of the other things is that you really need to know what your story demands of a model, or of a particular asset. Let's say for this model, I knew I was never going to have shots from inside the cockpit, so there's really nothing built in there. And I do go to the interior of this thing, but the interior that I've kind of written into the story is really just that it's an empty bay. A lot like most cargo planes, if they're not carrying anything, there's just like a very large empty space with maybe some securing hook lines and other methodologies for anchoring cargo in the bay, or emergency lights or things like that. But I really didn't need those for the scenes that I had inside this particular vehicle. So one of the other things that SketchUp is really good at is leveraging the component aspect of this. Now I want to show you what a component is. You can take, let's say I'm going to build an object really quickly here. It's not going to be a throwaway thing, but any element that you build in SketchUp is easier to manipulate if you either group it, let's say here, make group, or make component. Now there's similar things, but when you make a component, you get a lot of other information, all right? You get aspects of controlling the component, which can be duplicated and referenced throughout the scene. So this is now a component, this one shape. But I've also made all these other repeating elements components. Now these are all accessible. If you can see this, they're everywhere they appear in the model, they're highlighted when you're working on just one of them. So as soon as you've made an object a group under, or excuse me, made an object a component, you can edit the object. And as you can see there, every single referenced component in the scene has changed. It makes things a lot easier. If you were redrawing this by hand, you'd have to redraw every single tire. But for now, we've got, duplicated objects everywhere, which this came in really handy, as far as finding, the attitude of these, engine mounts. They're, when you want it, it's a VTOL aircraft. So if you were taking off, you could change the position and angle of these all at once. And that's extremely helpful. One of the other aspects of SketchUp and almost every 3D program now is the ability to isolate things in layers. Now this was really important for showing the vehicle landing as well as in flight, and that of course requires pulling up the landing gear. One thing you have to be aware of is that when you set an object to a layer can determine whether or not it shows, because let's say for instance you had multiple layers here. You see I turned off layer 0 and the entire object disappears. It's a fact that objects or components and groups and various things in SketchUp can appear on multiple layers, and it depends on which one you've set up. So just be aware of that individual components, individual objects, when you set these things up on layers is setting them up to be on multiple layers. The other thing that's really helpful in SketchUp, of course, if you're not comfortable with shadows, is whether they can be turned on and off at will. The shadows work in SketchUp like they do for most architectural programs. They're based on time of day. So bringing up your shadow panel, you're going to notice that it's unlike most 3D programs that give you a widget, of some kind to manipulate in space in your interface. These are based on, the architectural requirements of where are you in the world and when does the sun come up. You get some slightly artistic options, how dark are your shadows. which are to me partially useful. I'd rather have shadows rendered a little bit light so that I can emphasize them like I did in this panel, so that I can emphasize them as I want. Like this gives the impression that the vehicle is still in motion. The other thing that's incredibly useful for comics, at least, or for exporting your images from SketchUp, is how to set up scenes. And that's, basically under the animation tab, when you add a scene, you get the option to create, as you see here up in the tab, a reference point that you can get back to, which is basically just setting up, different shots. And the basics are simple enough. You can set this up. Also, I believe it reacts to styles. And styles are really just changing the global aspects of your viewport, to reflect, this is, I think, the default setup for SketchUp, older versions of SketchUp, to show you the horizon line, a rough gradient for your sky. That's great for rendering, scenes and stuff like that if you want to establish the background. But one of the styles I like to use is one of the default styles where almost all of I'll turn shadows on again. I meant to turn off guides and the axes. Since in previous projects, I was really just copying and pasting using this tool, which in Windows 10 is going away, and I believe I mentioned that in an earlier video. But I would just take a snap of this and copy and paste it into whatever program I was rendering in. Previously, that was GIMP, and now it's Clip Studio. But, using this style makes this a little easier. You paste this into a program, set it to multiply, turn down the opacity, or in Clip Studio, change the layer color, and then render over it. So that's it for this short video. Once again, the Kickstarter is still live, and as always, backers are getting this content first, as well as subscribers to the newsletter. I just wanted to make that really clear that these are all unlisted videos that I want people to get because they were really kind enough to come out for that first Kickstarter and my newsletter. And I think that's going to be that way for a while. So if you've been a subscriber, I really appreciate you following these videos. But they really are my way of rewarding the community for following the campaign and everything. It's been a really rewarding experience, and I want to give back no matter what. You don't actually have to pledge to the campaign at a high level to get any of this content. It really is for everybody that's been a subscriber or a newsletter subscriber. And that's it for today. Thanks, everybody.